Here is a graph showing the highest knockout percentages among fighters in the entire history of heavyweight boxing. This graph shows the top 12 highest percentages who are either now retired and are currently fighting within the division. And on the bottom on the x-axis, we have the knockout percentage. And also to the left on the y-axis, we have the total number of knockouts. These are two important statistics to help give us a better perspective of how resilient, robust, and exactly how dominant a fighter is during their entire career as a pro boxer. Bear in mind, the further right and further up the better. As you can see, most fighters fall within the middle, and this isn't really a bad thing, especially remembering the fact that only a small percentage of fighters are actually able to make this list. And as you go further up, you begin to see outliers, with the likes of Mike Tyson, Rocky Marciano, Shannon Briggs, and near the very top, George Foreman. And then you have Deontay Wilder, with an impressive true knockout percentage of 91% and currently stands as the only heavyweight in history with the highest knockout percentage. Let me also say this, Wilder has fought in a total number of 45 fights and has accomplished an unfathomable 41 knockouts in his career. Literally 41 out of 45. And to also emphasize how crazy this actually is, I also took the liberty to compare Wilder's figures to his current boxing contemporaries, and I gathered the numbers of the top 10 boxers currently listed in the heavyweight power rankings, and this is what I found. The current graph shows the total number of first round knockouts among current heavyweights. In other words, the total number of victories they've accomplished by a first round knockout, with the average length of time to achieve the first round knockout on the x-axis and the total number of first round knockouts on the y-axis. And this time around, the further left and further up the better. As you can see, there's a majority of fighters achieving about 5 first round knockouts with an average time of about 1 minute 35 seconds. And the further up you go, you now begin to see anomalies break off from the rest, with the likes of Robert Helenius, Anthony Joshua, and within his own dominant territory, Andy Ruiz, with a total of 9 first round knockouts trumping the rest of his peers. Now, you might be thinking, where's Deontay? He's right about here. Completely within his own stratosphere, being so far above his competition. You would honestly think the guy is an actual madman, having more than double of the second highest knockout victories by the first round. My man's seriously on violence. Wilder not only has a total of 19 first round knockout victories, he has also by far the greatest number of knockouts among the current heavyweights, nearly doubling Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua's knockouts entirely, and nearly quadrupling Alexander Usyk's total knockouts. Without a doubt, Deontay has made a lot of noise within the division and has certainly made known his presence all around the boxing world. And through his formidable and also wild power punches, he is able to annihilate his competition while embarking on his personal quest to become the greatest heavyweight. And as a result of his punching ability, this has allowed Deontay to have a stellar record of defeating over 90% of his opponents by knockout. Indeed, this is definitely a great achievement to win most of your fights, but I do think further inspection should be made into all of his previous opponents. Bluntly speaking, Deontay never really had world-class competition on his rise to becoming the WBC champion. Although you can make the case to say Fury has not faced amazing competition either, bar aside his victory over Vladimir Klitschko in 2015, and defeated the former Ukrainian champion to then acquire the WBA, WBO, IBF, and IBO championship titles. And taking this into consideration, it doesn't seem as though Wilder has encountered a fighter of similar skill and boxing finesse. Wilder seemed out of his depth during the whole trilogy against Fury, whereas typically for Deontay, he doesn't rely much on his boxing technique to defeat his opponents, and would only rely on his ability to pick out good counter punches in order to line himself up for a bombardment of erratic punches to defeat his opposition. Don't get it twisted, most of his knockout punches are extremely and methodically well timed, by delivering cranium-shattering punches to effectively finish the fight, and at times leaving his victims so discombobulated after hitting the canvas. Deontay has also not faced many opponents that are physically similar to Fury, and in terms of height, most of his former rivals were either usually much shorter or roughly the same height as Wilder, with the likes of Kelvin Price, Audley Harrison, and Dominic Breazeale to name a few fighters. And by having the height advantage usually correlates with a greater reach advantage to ultimately maintain a good striking distance whilst keeping the opponent at bay. Standing at 6'9" tall with a reach of 85 inches, the Gypsy King had the advantage in this department by having both 2 inches in height and reach over Wilder, and the difference in length became far more apparent as each fight of the trilogy progressed. For the very first time in his career, Deontay could no longer rely on his length within the ring to subdue and to overpower his opponent. All throughout the trilogy, Deontay most times seemed unable to switch up his approach to slow down Fury, And although he didn't exactly give Tyson the easiest 3 fights of his career, Fury was still able to dictate the fight by causing Deontay to second guess what Tyson might do. And this trilogy seriously exposed how helpless Deontay was when his go-to card, aka his right hand, was easy to anticipate. And although we knew that Wilder's most valued trump card was his right hand, we never quite understood the gravity of how extremely reliant he was with this approach. And so his most valued trump card became his biggest liability whilst fighting Tyson. And in the sport of boxing, maintaining a steady rhythm is crucial to build overall confidence whilst maintaining your effective boxing groove. But in the case for both fighters, they are both quite unorthodox in respect to how they box stylistically. But Tyson seems to have more of a consistent rhythm when compared to Deontay. Considering this factor, Fury has the upper hand, being able to quickly adjust his style and approach to match his opposition, and to also throw off his opponents with multiple head and body feints, all whilst nimbly moving around the ring. And now reflecting on the first fight in December 2018, this fighting bout may have been Deontay's best performance throughout the entire trilogy, and was the only fight that made it past the 12th round, with scores of 115 to 111 for Wilder, 114 to 112 for Fury, and 113 apiece for both, which resulted in the match being ruled as a draw. Many fans and watchers around the globe believed the final result to be highly controversial, and also believed that Deontay was the worst of the pair that night, with some further speculating that having the home advantage was the main reason for him retaining his WBC title. During the fight, Fury showed impressive and sometimes outrageous agility by dodging many of Wilder's heaviest punches, but by the 4th, Wilder clocked Tyson right on the nose to draw blood, and as a result, only 2 rounds later, Fury switched to a southpaw stance and pushed the bronze bomber onto the back foot. And then by the 9th round, Wilder dropped Fury with a 2-punch overhand combo, achieving a knockdown. And then by the next round, Wilder began to fatigue much more rapidly, and Fury would then take the advantage. Fury began to feel as though he could dodge any punch that Wilder would send his way, and unfortunately at the 12th round, Wilder let off a combo to viciously floor Tyson down to the canvas. And at that moment, the entire world, including myself, thought the fight was now entirely finished. And then miraculously, by whatever power gifted by the boxing gods, graced Fury with the strength to beat the 10 count, and then survived the remaining minutes to finally end the 12th. And although Tyson was knocked down twice, the fight showed that Deontay was masterfully outboxed. Now, during the lead up to the second fight in February 2020, Fury had split up with his old trainer Ben Davison, who had coached Fury since late 2017 and helped him lose the weight he gained during his hiatus. Both Wilder and Fury entered the ring at a near career heavy of 231 pounds and 273 pounds respectively, both being 19 and 17 pounds heavier than the first matchup, and it was quite clear that both sides aimed for more power. And really for the majority of the fight, Fury had Wilder in his back pocket, having no room to do anything whatsoever. Tyson generally maintained the center of the ring for the entire fight and kept Wilder at bay with his jab and looked for his big shots to land. And then in the 3rd round, Fury dropped Wilder with a massive right hand to the temple, which caused Wilder's left ear to stream with blood and left him visibly disorientated as he beat the 10 count. After falling to the canvas another 2 times, the referee Kenny Bayless ruled them both to be slips and not actual knockdowns. And by the 5th round, Fury knocked down Wilder again with a combination of body punches, which was then finished off with a brutal left hook. Deontay, now bleeding from both his ear and mouth, honestly looked like he had been hit by a double-decker bus. And then the fight would be stopped midway through a barrage of heavy punches by Fury, and resulted in Wilder's corner throwing in the towel to spare Deontay from the abuse. And in this second fight, Wilder simply had no answer for Fury. And now we then finally get to the actual trilogy, which hopefully might be their last matchup between the two. Just over 3 weeks ago, we were able to watch one of the most entertaining fights so far into this year, witnessing an action-packed heavyweight classic with many surprises coming from both sides. On that night, both men exchanged a total of 5 knockdowns throughout the entire fight. Wilder entered the fight with a good intensity by establishing his jab against the new champion, and Fury immediately responded back in the second with solid punches within the clinch. And then midway by the 3rd round, Wilder was lucky enough to avoid the count after getting dropped by the champion, and with less than a minute later, Wilder was saved by the bell, avoiding a second knockdown. With a sudden change of events into the 4th, Wilder now came with a crashing right hand to put Fury down to the floor, and further continued forward to send the champion down again at the end of the round for a total of 2 knockdowns. And now at this point, the fight was fair game. During the middle rounds, Tyson was able to recover from the damage sustained from the 4th, and then got to work on Wilder by ultimately schooling him on the scorecards. Now being brutally beaten up, Wilder's accumulated damage and exhaustion became much more clearly visible. And then in the 10th round, Fury swiftly decked Wilder to his knees with one of the cleanest right hooks I've probably ever seen. And going out on his shield, Wilder beats the count and responds with a series of wild swings near the end of the round. But all the damage had already been done, and then finally by the 11th round, the entire fight was put to bed with an even cleaner right hook putting Wilder down to the canvas, which caused the fight being waved off as a knockout victory for Tyson Fury. And the final result of this matchup meant that Fury successfully defended his WBC title, while Deontay Wilder had completely been conquered throughout the entire trilogy by losing 2 consecutive fights. I think it's quite clearly obvious to recognize who the better fighter was during the entire trilogy, but I think the fighting statistics truly show how night and day the difference was between both fighters. According to the CompuBox punching statistics, which records the percentages of every single jab and every single power punch thrown, shows that Fury dominated in every single category. Every single one. Highlighting that Wilder was awfully inaccurate with his punching selection. Despite Deontay being spontaneously erratic with his approach to boxing, has allowed him to make a mark in the division by defeating several of his opponents along the way. Now when you compare him to the Gypsy King, well on paper anyways, the trilogy matchup does seem to make sense. When you now compare both fighters, you begin to see the glaring similarities they both shared during their boxing careers. For instance, their age and also their amateur record, both exactly fighting a total number of 35 amateur fights, and also the number of unbeaten defeats, whereby defeating opponents who were also on an unbeaten streak during their careers. And now on the flip side, you also begin to notice major glaring differences with regards to the professional record and the total number of rounds fought, but more interestingly, both their world title defenses. And on paper, it is certainly true that Wilder has more title defenses than Fury, but it certainly doesn't mean that Deontay is the much better fighter, but rather, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the caliber of all previous rivals must be taken into consideration when viewing this statistic. And when it comes to looking at these figures, it can only explain so much of the greater picture by only giving us a glimpse of the entire story whilst ignoring key underlying details. Although originally I was not a fan of Wilder prior to this trilogy, but he has certainly earned more of my respect as a fighter and was willing to go out on a shield and also as a warrior with no personal regard for his safety. And this is the thing that many in the division are not willing to do. Deontay still has a long way to go if he aims to be in the conversation of being regarded as one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And as it currently stands, he is currently nowhere near, but I do hope he gets closer to that goal. Now, as long as Wilder remains with his old approach, it seems rather unlikely for Wilder to defeat Tyson if in the future Fury were to become undisputed. And also remembering the fact that Alexander Usyk currently holds all major heavyweight belts except the WBC and lineal titles, and depending on the winner of the rematch between Joshua and Usyk will inevitably determine the next opponent for Tyson Fury. And only then the victor of this future matchup will have the honor of becoming the new undisputed champion since Lennox Lewis over 20 years ago. Thank you all for tuning into this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.